All right, well, thank you for the songs and the music this evening. We're going to be going to Mark chapter 14. So we are going back to our series. We have been studying the doctrine of the church for a little while now. And this is message number 63 in our doctrinal study series. And the title of this message is Passover in Jerusalem. And so we're going to start in Mark chapter 14 and verse number 12. And the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover, his disciples said unto him, Where wilt thou that we go and prepare that thou mayest eat the Passover? In the previous message in this series, we noted the fourth command of the Great Commission was to teach baptized disciples to observe all the things that Jesus has commanded. And that, of course, includes all of his word through the prophets and the apostles. Everything he has commanded to do, everything that he has commanded not to do, to teach for that not to be done. Now, this does not include the keeping of the Old Covenant law. And we've covered this previously earlier on in this study, so I'm not going to revisit all of that, but I think we had a couple messages there of how Christians relate to the Old Covenant law and such. But that, obviously, his command that we are to keep and to do does not include the Old Covenant law. And in the last message of this series in particular, we asked about the feasts and festivals of Israel. So Jesus says, teach them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. And so does that include the feasts and festivals of Israel? We considered the Jewish calendar of the Old Testament and how that the lives of the people of Israel revolved around these feasts. Now, obviously, it was an agrarian society, and so you can see reflections in the calendar of the agricultural seasons. But also these feasts were placed and spaced throughout there so that really their lives just revolved around it, and particularly the three pilgrim feasts, the Feast of Passover and Pentecost and of Tabernacles. So you can't miss how important these feasts were to Israel, to those Torah observant Jews. And it's obvious that the Jewish Christians in the New Testament still observed those feasts and customs as well. Now, Jesus did not command his churches to observe those feasts, and this is confirmed by the teaching of the apostles after him. So the short answer to our question was simply no. Churches are not to observe those feasts. There's not something that we have been commanded to do, and therefore that's not something that we are commanded to teach baptized disciples to do. But Jesus' command to teach to observe all things that he has commanded does include observing the Lord's Supper as the New Testament churches did and as they were instructed to by the apostles. Now, this Lord's Supper included Jews and Gentiles in these church bodies that observed this Lord's Supper. Now, this Lord's Supper is obviously connected with the Passover in some ways. So does it mean the continuance of the Passover in some way? So maybe we don't observe these other feasts and fasts and what have you, but maybe there's some continuation of Passover in this way. And well, the short answer to that, again, would be no. And as Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 7 to 8, purge out therefore the old leaven, that you may be a new lump as ye are unleavened. For even Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, neither with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Now there Paul is using the emblems of the Passover. He's using those in a context to speak of church discipline. We know in 1 Corinthians 5, this is the passage where Paul is addressing the issue of the man that's unrepentant in sin in the congregation there. and that he should have already been put out, and he needs to be put out. And so he's using this as a backdrop. But he makes that statement that Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. So there is no more Passover, since Christ is our Passover once for all, sacrificed for us. So again, we could talk about that in terms of Old Covenant law and these various things. But the Lord's Supper was instituted in the context of the Passover. And in order to understand it, then we do need to understand the Passover in the New Testament in particular. So in this message, I want to answer two questions that are going to prepare us as we proceed in our study of the Lord's Supper. Number one, how was Passover observed in the times of Jesus? And number two, was the supper where Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper a Passover supper? So we'll deal with the first question first. How was the Passover observed? So what was the Passover like in the days of Jesus Christ? And we can see that even in our text in Mark chapter 14 and verse 12, the first day of unleavened bread when they killed the Passover. And then we know from on there, we get the institution of the Lord's Supper and all that things in the upper room. And again, we'll deal with all those details as we move along. But the last time, or the last message, we considered the Passover event that led to the recurring celebration of Passover. In other words, the Passover originally referred to the event of the Passover in Egypt before leading to the exodus from Egypt and going into the wilderness and so on. So the original Passover was an event. It wasn't a memorial. It wasn't any sort of a religious observance or anything like that. It was an event in which they were commanded to take certain actions and to do certain things. And then the last plague was going to come upon Egypt, and God was going to bring his people out. He was going to redeem them, free them from the bondage of Egypt. And so obviously the Passover observances afterward, which were memorial and commemorative, would necessarily be somewhat different from the original. So the point is, you had the original event of the Passover, and then you had the Passover being observed afterward. And the observations of the Passover afterward, even what we have in the biblical record, is going to show some changes. And when you get to, for instance, even when you get to later in the Old Covenant law and the laws pertaining to the Passover and such, you see that there are some changes to the Passover that come about. Some of those would be that it was made a pilgrim feast. The Passover was made one of these feasts where all of the males, the circumcised males of Israel, were required to appear in what ultimately would become Jerusalem, the place where God would set his name. One of the differences would be that the original event was to be eaten in haste, standing up with everyone dressed for travel. I mean, ready to go right then. Obviously, the later Passover was not eaten that way. And we could go on with some of those, but there was changes that necessarily would take place to the Passover. The Passover was also expanded somewhat through later customary elements. All right, so the original observance was very simple, with the simple elements of the Passover lamb, the bitter herbs, and unleavened bread. I mean, these were all of the elements. It was a very simple affair. Now, the Passover of Second Temple Judaism. So when we refer to Second Temple Judaism, we're talking about after the return. So after Jerusalem's destroyed, they're carried away into the Babylonian captivity. After the return begins, they begin rebuilding Jerusalem and the wall and the temple is rebuilt. And so you have this regathering of Israel. Second Temple Judaism is what would have been in effect during the time of Jesus. That would have went from that time all the way up to 70 A.D. when Jerusalem and the temple was destroyed in the first century in 70 A.D. All right, so the Passover in Second Temple Judaism was somewhat different from that of the Old Testament Israel Passover that we read of. Now, we don't have the documentation to recreate an early to mid first century Passover 100%. But with the Bible record that we have, and with Jewish writings that were around the same time, such as the writings of Josephus and some later writings, which would be like the second century Mishnah and Talmud and such, we can be confident that we have an accurate picture of what the Passover was like in Jerusalem in that time. There probably could be some variance, but that variance would be more minor details, not affecting the majority of the practice. Now, most of the prescriptive elements for the observance of the Passover in that time period come from the Mishnah, which is a Jewish collection of rabbinical writings. Now, the Mishnah was put down in the second century, but it does agree with the biblical accounts and the other Jewish sources that were more from the time of the first century. So, what I want to do is I want to walk through a first century Passover observance as well as, again, as we can recreate it. And I think we can be confident that we have a fairly accurate picture. Obviously, modern day Passover celebration it's also different in some ways, but there are certain key elements that are still there. So when it comes to the first century Passover, the preparations would actually begin about a month beforehand. And these preparations would be things like repairs to the roads and to the bridges and things like that. And they would be ready to accommodate all of these travelers. Now, I've seen a few different numbers, but Josephus did estimate the number of Jews in and around Jerusalem for the feast to be somewhere around 3 million. And apparently there was some sort of a record kept of the number of lambs that were slaughtered for the Passover. And so it's sort of a backward calculation that says about this many people per lamb would lead to such and such. So that's how he arrived at that figure. I think it's something like 2.7 million people that would be in and around Jerusalem at the time of Passover in the first century. And obviously that's a very large number. And again, I've seen some other estimates that would be a little less than that, but it seems like that we can be reasonably certain that it was maybe somewhere between 1.5 million to 3 million that would be in Jerusalem at that time. Rooms that would be rented out would have to be prepared as well. You see, the Passover at one time in Second Temple Judaism was held at the temple complex. So those Jews that would appear in Jerusalem would eat the Passover actually at the temple. But as the numbers involved in this increased, there came to be a point where that just wasn't possible. And so essentially all Jerusalem began to be considered as the temple area for the purpose of eating the feast. And so you would have many that would be camped outside of Jerusalem, and they would, go into Jerusalem within the extents of the city to eat the feast, and then return to their camps or whatever. Some would stay in homes and various things. But there would be rooms that would be rented out for these travelers to use to observe the feast of the Passover in. And so those would have to be ready. Another way that preparation would have to be made is that the graves would have to be whitewashed so that the travelers wouldn't accidentally come in contact with them and be defiled so that they could not eat the Passover. And this was probably one of the reasons for this was that there would be common graves sometimes in the fields. I believe is the law dictated that a body, someone that had died, and bodies found in the field, it has to be buried right there, and so on. So these graves throughout Jerusalem would be whitewashed. They would be very easily marked visibly so that they could be avoided. Now, as we get to preparation for the Passover, the preparations proper really begin on Nisan 13, and I gave you that handout of the calendar, and you've all probably memorized that since last week, so you've got that ready to mind. The 13th day of the month Nisan. This was when This was the day before the killing of the Passover lamb, and it was the day when the heads of households would search the houses to rid them of leaven. And now leaven would refer to any fermented doughs that would be used. That is something that we would call starters, or any sort of leavened bread that had been baked was to be removed from the house. So no leaven then was allowed to be in the houses until the end of the festival period on the 21st of Nisan. On the 14th of Nisan, now this is the 14th day of that month, between 2 and 3 in the afternoon on the 14th of Nisan, the Passover lambs would be slaughtered at the temple. So on the 15th then of Nisan, the middle of the month, after sunset, now you have to remember the evening of the 15th of Nisan would begin just a few hours after the lambs were slain on the afternoon of the 14th of Nisan, because the day started in the evening. That was when they started observing a new day. And there is some difference between when exactly that time would come. Some would say sunset, some would say from the time the sun began going down, some would say only when it was completely dark. And so there's a little bit of variance as to when exactly that new day began. But the 14th was when it was slaughtered near the end of the day on the 14th. So that would have been that afternoon. And then that evening would have started the 15th of Nisan. And that was the day that the Passover meal was to be eaten. And it was to be eaten at night. And so at that time, it would have been eaten just after the first stars appeared in the sky. Now, I don't know exactly how they handled the overcast conditions and then that sort of thing, but those things would be accommodated for so that it was eaten after dark on the 15th of Nisan. So the actual eating of the Passover itself involved obviously a table. The table would have been a low table, maybe around about 18 inches high, and they would sit, or more often it's referred to as reclining at the table. So they would sort of be sitting on pillows. They'd be reclining to their left on the table. I believe that the sort of their feet would be, legs and feet would be, going out and sort of behind the person, next to them. They would be reclining at the table. The places at the tables would all be assigned, and it would begin with the host or the head of the family, and then it would move from there to order of importance. So you had the host, which would be considered the primary seat at the table, and then the next most important seat would be whoever the highest ranking, most honored guest was at the feast, at the observance, and then from there it would go moving around in order of importance. The table would be set for the start of the meal with the bitter herbs, which was a mixture of sauce and lettuce, and sometimes other vegetables could be used besides lettuce, unleavened bread, and vinegar. Now, each seat had 4 cups at the setting for the ritual wine that was to be drunk over the course of the meal. Now, the Mishnah specified that only red wine was to be used, that it was to be diluted in order to prevent drunkenness, and it could be diluted with water. And what I've read, it would bring it to an alcohol content of about 3%. And so, in today's reckoning, we would consider that to be a cheap or a sweet wine, not one that was high and strong in alcoholic content. The 4 cups were drank at different set points during the supper. Now, the wine of the 4 cups was considered, according to the Mishnah, what was called ritual wine. And there was also a non-ritual wine that would also be drank during the supper, and it would be diluted as well. So the Mishnah then specified that even the poorest of Israel was required to drink the 4 cups of wine for the Passover. And if any were too poor to afford it, the Mishnah specified that they were to buy it with money from the poor's box. In other words, the alms and offerings that would be given to the poor for that purpose, so that those that were too poor to afford all the necessary elements and whatever that they needed for the Passover, they could get it from that box. The Talmud went on to say that if for some reason that didn't work, or he couldn't do that for some reason, that he should sell or pawn his coat and buy the wine that was needed for the Passover. Now, the meal itself began with the host praying the blessing over the meal and over the first cup of wine. Now, these prayers were scripted. You have them set down in the Mishnah. They were sort of formulaic. For instance, each cup in the 4 cups of the Passover supper was preceded by this prayer: "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who creates the fruit of the vine." Now, the first cup then was followed by a ritual hand washing. And this was a customary hand washing that the Jews observed at that time before that they would touch any food. So, first cup, ritual hand washing. Next would be the lettuce would be dipped in the vinegar and eaten. So, the host would dip the lettuce into the vinegar, and the host would do this simultaneously with the chief guest, the guest of honor, at the same time. They would dip in the vinegar at the same time, and they would eat together, and then this would be passed down around the table until all had partaken. And once all had partaken, then all food was removed from the table. Then at that point, the second cup of wine would be poured. The unleavened bread then would be placed on the table, and it would be uncovered. And as I understand it, there would be 3 unleavened loaves of bread that would be placed on the table. Now, at this point, the host would take the lead in explaining the significance of the elements of the supper. And I'm sort of hitting the high points. Like there was a number of all sorts of sort of ritual statements and things that were made at every step along the way, and all these things that were being done were accompanied by that. And again, we get that primarily from the Mishnah. And so the host would then be prompted by questions. And I believe in many cases it would be his oldest son that would ask these questions. And the questions were scripted. I believe the Mishnah had 3 of them at this point. And so they would enable the host to explain the significance of all these elements, what they represented, what they symbolized. And in the course of this meal, you would have a retelling of the Exodus story. Now, at this point, the first part of the Hallel would be sung. So the first part of the Hallel here being Psalms 113 and 114. They would be sung. Then the second cup of wine would be prayed over with, again, that ritual prayer. And then they would be drunk. The second cup would be drunk. And then there would be another ritual hand washing at this point. So then at this point, the host prays over the unleavened bread and then breaks it and then shares it around the table. The roasted lamb, along with the bitter herbs and the unleavened bread, would then be eaten at this point in the Passover supper. And during the eating of this is one of the places where the non-ritual wine would be consumed. So again, you had the 4 cups for the ritual wine to be consumed, and then you had non-ritual wine that would be consumed at other points during the meal, this being one of those points. So the eating of the Passover lamb with the bitter herbs and the unleavened bread would be eaten, and non-ritual wine would be drunk at this point. Then the third cup would be poured, and the last unleavened bread loaf would be blessed, it would be broken, and it would be eaten in a similar manner as before. The third cup would then be prayed over with the same liturgical type of prayer, and then the third cup would be drunk. At this point in the Passover supper, the 4th cup of wine would be poured, And the second part of the Hallel would be sung. So the Hallel would be Psalms 113 through Psalm 118. And so at this point, Psalms 115 to Psalm 118 would be sung. And after that was finished, the fourth cup of wine would be drunk and the supper would be concluded. All right, so that's a basic outline of the Passover supper eaten on the 15th of Nisan, the night of the 15th of Nisan, during the first century, during the time of Jesus and his disciples there in Jerusalem. And then began the feast of unleavened bread that lasted 7 days until the 21st of Nisan. All right, so that is again a picture that we put together from all the sources that we have available to us of what was being observed. Now, there are sometimes some of those elements are questioned. For instance, the 4 cups of wine, it said, was not. Some have said, well, that didn't develop until later. There was only 2 cups of wine at that point, and that doesn't seem correct because of actually the biblical account when it is compared with this Passover picture that we've put together. We're not going to get to all of that tonight, but it doesn't seem correct. It does seem that this was a 4-cup observance. There are some that argue it wasn't, but it seems that it was. And again, I do believe with all the sources combined with the biblical record, I do believe we get a very accurate picture of what this supper was like at this time. So that brings us now to the second question is, well, was this Last Supper where Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper, was it a Passover meal or was it some other sort of meal? So were Jesus and his disciples eating a Passover supper that would have included the eating of the roasted lamb, or were they eating something else when he instituted the Lord's Supper? Now that might seem like a silly question to ask, and if you've never looked into this, you've never looked into the chronology of the Gospels and the life of Christ and of all of these events and all those sort of things, it might seem like, well, that seems like a silly question. I mean, if all we read was Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in fact, we wouldn't even think of that question. It wouldn't even seem possible. And the primary reason that this question comes is because of a statement in John's Gospel in John chapter 18 and verse number 28, which reads, "Then led they Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment, and it was early. And they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover." So obviously, this is after the Lord's Supper has been instituted. Jesus had been arrested and he has been tried by the Jews and has been delivered to Pilate by this time. And we're told there that the Jews that took him to Pilate did not want to enter into the place of the Gentiles unless they would be defiled and not able to eat the Passover. So, what eating of the Passover is being referred to here? Now, the answers actually to this question are all over the place. Some say that Jesus and his disciples ate a special pre-Passover meal because he knew that he would be arrested, and whatever, and he wouldn't be able to eat the actual Passover meal with his disciples. There are some others that have espoused a 2 Passover meals theory just because of the number of people involved and such things. There are others that suggest some other things, such as that, well, John is just inconsistent with the other Gospels. He's not trying to give us a chronological events, but he's giving us sort of some theological, typological type of thing. So what is it? So Jesus and his disciples ate the Passover meal, including the Passover lamb, on the evening of the 15th of Nisan. And all the gospel accounts are harmonized once we take into account the terminology that is used, and particularly that the term Passover was used in the first century and even well before that in 4 different ways. And really, once you see this, it's really pretty simple. And I don't know why there are so many that continue to have such a problem with it, but nevertheless. So this word Passover, the Pascha, the word was used in four different ways. It was used to refer to the lamb that was slain on the 14th of Nisan. So when you see a reference to, for instance, like killing the Passover, well, that's simply using the word Passover and referring to the actual lamb that was slain on the 14th of Nisan and eaten on the 15th of Nisan. The word was also used to refer to the meal in which the lamb was eaten on the 15th of Nisan. The word was also used to refer to the Passover peace offerings that was slain and eaten during the Feast of Unleavened Bread on the 15th of Nisan, that whole time to the 21st of Nisan. And the word was used to refer to the entire celebration, that time from the 14th of Nisan to the 21st of Nisan. So Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, all in under one umbrella as Passover. So we can find all four of those uses of the word for Passover in the Bible as well as in other Jewish writings. In other words, it's entirely consistent. So we see each of those ways used in the Bible, and here's a place where we get three of them in one passage, Luke chapter 22 and verses 1 to 11. So Luke chapter 22, verses 1 to 11. Now the feast of unleavened bread drew nigh, which is called the Passover. All right, so here the word Passover is being used to refer to this entire time of the Passover observance, sometimes referred to as the Feast of Unleavened Bread, sometimes referred to as the Passover. So we see one usage right there. Let's go on reading. And the chief priests and scribes sought how they might kill him, for they feared the people. Then entered Satan into Judas, surnamed Iscariot, being of the number of the 12. And he went his way and communed with the chief priests and captains how he might betray him unto them. And they were glad and covenanted to give him money. And he promised and sought opportunity to betray him unto them in the absence of the multitude. Now, verse 7. Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. So here we have a second use of the word Passover, referring to the Passover lamb that was killed on the 14th of Nisan. And he sent Peter and John, saying, Go and prepare us the Passover, that we may eat. And they said unto him, Where wilt thou that we prepare? And he said unto them, Behold, when ye are entered into the city, there shall a man meet you, bearing a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house where he entereth in. And here in verse 11, And ye shall say unto the goodman of the house, The master saith unto thee, Where is the guest chamber where I shall eat the Passover? And this would then be a reference to the Passover meal on the 14th of Nisan, when the Passover lamb was eaten. He says, with my disciples, the end of verse number 11. All right, so there in one passage, we have the word Passover used in three different ways to refer to the entire time of that celebration, which would have included Passover proper and the Feast of Unleavened Bread that immediately followed it. We have it used to refer to the actual lamb that was killed on the 14th of Nisan, the Passover lamb. And we have it used to refer to the actual meal where that lamb was eaten on the 15th of Nisan. So again, three different uses in all just one passage. And again, those four different uses are in the Bible. There's other places besides here, but this is one passage that uses it in three different ways. All right, now that leaves us with one reference to using the Passover to refer to the meal of the peace offering during the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. And the peace offering, according to the Old Covenant law, was an offering that was made, and the various requirements of it, from the flocks to the herds and whatever, and it was offered. It was a burnt offering, but it wasn't a whole burnt offering. Part that would be offered and burnt on the altar, and the other part would be eaten by those that brought it. Sometimes it would be eaten by the Levites and things as well. So the peace offering was an offering that wasn't wholly consumed by fire on the altar, but it was only partly burnt, and the other part of the animal then would be eaten in a meal, a peace meal, and this was the peace offering. So there were certain peace offerings attached to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. All right, so we see the requirements here. Let's start in Exodus chapter 34, verses 18 to 20. The feast of unleavened bread shalt thou keep. 7 days thou shalt eat unleavened bread, as I commanded thee, in the time of the month Abib, and that is another name for Nisan. For in the month Abib thou camest out from Egypt. All that openeth the matrix is mine, and every firstling among thy cattle, whether ox or sheep, that is male. But the firstling of an ass thou shalt redeem with a lamb, and if thou redeem him not, then shalt thou break his neck. All the firstborn of thy sons thou shalt redeem. Notice this, and none shall appear before me empty. All right, so what's he talking about here? He's talking about that when they go up to Jerusalem, which is what it would ultimately be, when they would go up to Jerusalem for the Feast of Unleavened Bread, they were to bring all that opens the matrix, the firstling of the cattle, the ox, or the sheep. If it be an ass, it had to be redeemed with a lamb. In other words, it had to have a lamb substituted in its place that it would come. So that those that came up for the Feast of Unleavened Bread were not to come up empty-handed. Now, they did have the option, if they had a long trip, they could actually sell the animal and then bring the money to Jerusalem. And once they got there, purchase an animal to use in this offering and to eat the peace meal of afterwards. Again, here in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verses 16 to 17. 3 times in a year shall all thy males appear before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose. Again, that became Jerusalem. In the feast of unleavened bread, and in the feast of weeks, and in the feast of tabernacles. And they shall not appear before the Lord empty. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of the Lord thy God, which he hath given thee. This would be the firstlings of the flocks and the herds. So how do we see this in practice? Well, we do see it in practice in a couple of places in 2 Chronicles. So 2 Chronicles chapter number 30. 2 Chronicles chapter 30, verses 21 and 22. And the children of Israel that were present at Jerusalem kept the feast of unleavened bread 7 days with great gladness. And the Levites and the priests praised the Lord day by day, singing with loud instruments unto the Lord. And Hezekiah spake comfortably unto all the Levites that taught the good knowledge of the Lord. And they did eat throughout the feast 7 days, offering peace offerings and making confession to the Lord God of their fathers. So during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, these peace offerings would be eaten. 2 Chronicles chapter 35, verses 7 to 9. And Josiah gave to the people of the flock lambs and kids, all for the Passover offerings, for all that were present to the number of 30,000, and 3,000 bullocks. These were of the king's substance. And his princes gave willingly unto the people, to the priests, and to the Levites, Hilkiah and Zechariah and Jehiel, rulers of the house of God, gave unto the priests for the Passover offerings 2,600 small cattle and 300 oxen. Conaniah and also Shemaiah and Nethanel, his brethren, and Hashabiah and Jael and Jozabad, chief of the Levites, gave unto the Levites for Passover offerings 5,000 small cattle and 500 oxen. Now, if you noticed, that's not Passover lambs, cattle and oxen. These are animals that were not permitted. It had to be a firstling of the flock, a first year, the male without blemish, and all of that. So what are these Passover offerings that he's talking about? Well, again, it's these peace offerings that were commanded to be brought. This in the days of Josiah was when he gave these Passover offerings. Like he gave them himself to the people to observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread with these Passover offerings. Flocks and herds are specifically referred to as Passovers. Deuteronomy chapter 16, verses 1 to 2. Observe the month of Abib and keep the Passover unto the Lord thy God. For in the month of Abib, the Lord thy God brought thee forth out of Egypt by night. Thou shalt therefore sacrifice the Passover unto the Lord thy God of the flock and the herd in the place which the Lord shall choose to place his name there. So we see in these passages that the Passover could refer to the Passover lamb that was killed and eaten killed on the 14th of Nisan, eaten on the 15th of Nisan, And it also referred to what could be lambs, or um, it could be cattle, it could be bullocks, could be oxen, could be different animals. And they're also here called Passovers by this same term, and they were the peace offerings that were eaten. So the ritual purity that was required for the Passover was required to be kept during the entire Passover observance. So the Jews then would not enter the place of the Gentiles because they didn't want to be defiled from eating the Passover, which was not the Passover meal of the Passover lamb, but was rather the peace offering sacrificed and eaten during the feast of the unleavened bread. In other words, all of the gospel accounts agree together because this term was used in different ways. Even in the Gospel of John, I think at least three of those ways that the word Passover was used is used in the Gospel of John alone. So we have considered the customary Passover of the first century that Jesus and his disciples observed. We have also confirmed that it was indeed the Passover lamb meal that was different from, but was connected to, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So now we have this foundation in place to look at the biblical account of the Last Supper that we're going to do in upcoming messages as we work through the various parts of what we have here in the gospel accounts. But that's all of our message for this evening, and so we will close with a hymn.